So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues from around the world. I see we have almost 100 people with us now, so I think we'll get started. For the second of 3 webinars in IIEP's Knowledge Sharing Forum, which has been generously supported by funding from the EU Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. For the webinar today, we will begin with short presentations looking at how our speakers, and we have some great speakers lined up today, how our speakers engage with system capacities and MoE leadership. We will then have a short moderated discussion, and then today we've structured it so that we have a second hour of breakout sessions. And during this time, participants will have a chance to really share their experience and insights with other colleagues and delve deeper into what systems capacities for leadership really means and looks like in country contexts. Like I said, we have a great lineup today. We have with us Anne Wathira-Gachoya, who is the Deputy Director of Education in the Directorate of Policy, Partnerships, and the East African Community Affairs at the Ministry of Education in Kenya. She's responsible for coordinating and monitoring education policies, plans, including plans for risk management. And she's a member of the Education National Committee on Prevention, Control, and Management of COVID in basic education institutions. So welcome, Anne. We also have with us Lama El Natour from the Ministry of Education in Jordan, where she is the Executive Director of the Development Coordination Unit. And she has over 20 years of experience in project and program management, grants and contracts management, finance, training and assessment, and operational management with government and international organizations. So welcome to Lama. Barbara Tournier is one of our program specialists here at IIEP, and she coordinates research and training on education workforce issues. So we're very pleased to have her with us today. She's most recently worked on instructional leadership at the middle tier, which we'll hear about today. And then finally, we have Charlotte Jones, who is the Global Head of Research and Development at Education Development Trust. And she has a very strong background in workforce reform and behavior change and is passionate about turning theory into action, as are we. And that's why we're here today. We are going to get right into the heart of the matter. During the session, please use the Padlet. We've decided to use this Padlet tool to share your thoughts, your questions in real time. Our colleagues from the Crisis Sensitive Planning Cluster will be reviewing your questions, your input that you can include on that Padlet. And we really look forward to hearing from you on the Padlet. And let me just take you quickly through how to use the Padlet, if you'll go to the next slide. So you'll see this screen with a set of 4 columns. And what you can do there is, if you go to the next slide, when you want to add a comment, you click on the little plus sign, and then a box will come up, which you can see there. Subsequently, if you can add your name, your organization, and your country so that we know a little bit about the context where your question or comment is coming from, that'll be extremely helpful. And then in the next box, you enter your question, your comments, your thoughts, and then hit the bright pink key that says publish. And there you go. Your point will be made. Great. So let's dive right in, get to the heart of the matter. So we know that leadership is critical to the performance of organizations in almost every sector of the economy. And we particularly noticed that is true in COVID, for example, and particularly so for the education sector. MoE leadership is key in crisis settings to ensure the continuity of learning, but also the sustainability and relevance of investments that are often made on the basis of decisions that in the heat of the moment, in the midst of the crisis, that are made very rapidly. And linking emergency responses to national development goals for the education sector requires MoE leadership at national and subnational levels, and also at school levels, as we've seen. So we set out at IIEP-UNESCO to better understand those factors that enable or constrain Ministry of Education leadership, to build evidence both to inform our own capacity development initiatives, but also to inform efforts made by humanitarian actors so that MoE authorities at all levels are effectively able to lead crisis response efforts and to improve the sustainability, scalability, and relevance of those interventions. Next slide, please. So one framework that's been very helpful in understanding Ministry of Education leadership in crisis settings has been this framework that you see on the screen, which was developed by our colleagues at the University of Bristol-Syre. And it was actually presented in our first webinar and a recent podcast, the links to which should be in the chat. So it involves, the framework involves looking at leadership as situated kind of in the political economy of the country, in the cultures, the context, and realities of the specific education system, and looking at how the different levels of the national administration, so which is where you see in the middle circle, the central, middle tier, and local levels, how those different levels interact. And the framework kind of puts forward three, let's say, key pillars that support leadership in crisis settings. Systems capacities, which you see in the blue circle, efforts to democratize governance, and systems learning. And I would really advise you to have a listen to the IIEP's first podcast that came out recently, which delves more in depth into this framework, and to look at our first webinar, which was focused around discussions around the framework. But for today's purposes, if you'll go to the next slide, please, we are going to focus more on the system capacities that are needed for the ministry at the different levels for leadership in crisis settings. And we'll hear from our experts and discuss together collectively in the group work what capacities are important, not only for the central level, but also for those individuals that work on the middle tier and also at school level. So we'll hear a little bit more about what capacities and competencies that school level leaders need to have in crisis settings for effective leadership. And at IIEP, we tend to frame our thinking around and to kind of try to shed light on both the contextual factors, which you see kind of in the outside circle, things such as the regional context, international commitments, but also looking at capacities of the public administration and the MoE more specifically that either enable or constrain MoEs to plan and manage crises. And when we think about those specific capacities, we talk about, as you can see in the top circle in the middle, institutional capacities. So laws, normative frameworks. We talk about also organizational capacities, HR arrangements, coordination mechanisms, plans, operational plans, for example. And we also talk about individual capacities, which can include soft skills, interpersonal communication skills, or more technical skills for crisis response and management. And if we go to, thank you, to the next slide. So let's look at some examples quickly, and we'll hear much more from the speakers. But just wanted to give some examples that have emerged from our series of case studies. For example, the leadership of central level authorities is enhanced when there are institutional capacities such as the political will to lead crisis prevention and response activities, or when there are national public sector reforms for crisis risk management and planning. Central level leadership can also be enhanced when investments are made for organizational capacities such as data and information management systems, or when authorities are able to sufficiently staff their ministries with people who have the technical individual skills to manage and use information systems. Middle tier leaders, for example, need to have organizational capacities for communicating and coordinating through managing school clusters and facilitating kind of the lateral learning that can take place. Middle tier leaders might also need to have capacities at the individual level to be able to coach school leaders, to identify professional development needs and professional development opportunities, for example. And last but certainly not least, the school level leaders can demonstrate leadership by being outspoken advocates for crisis risk management, and also having those technical and interpersonal skills that allow them to really galvanize school communities to respond effectively to crises. And then one thing that is key to consider as kind of common capacities for each of the administrative levels are coordination and communication. And ensuring that the different levels speak to each other. So from the local level to the middle tier to the central level and back down, and that information, is continuously flowing, that there are the flexible feedback loops is essential. And also ensuring that there's the lateral communication, right, within the ministry at the central level, that the different units are speaking to each other and coordinating their efforts, for example. So that it was just a quick introduction to the framing of today's session. And I'm going to turn now to our colleagues that are on the panel for some opening remarks. And I would like to first hand over to the colleague from the Ministry of Education, Ms. Anne Gachoya. So over to you, Anne, for your remarks.
Thank you very much. We can move to the next slide. Capacities are indeed very helpful. Kenya, like many other countries, was not spared the COVID-19 pandemic effect, and all schools, including tertiary institutions, were closed in March 2020. Our phased reopening started in October, and some of the capacities that the Ministry of Education had was already there existed an education disaster management policy, which is being implemented. It was developed in the year 2017, and this gave some impetus when COVID struck the country. At the education headquarters, there is an establishment of an education in emergency unit, which is within the Ministry of Education. Alongside that, there is an authority for the country called the National Disaster Management Authority, which works very closely with the education in emergency unit within the Ministry of Education. Kenya also has the National Education Sector Strategic Plan 2018 to 2022, and this document was very helpful since it had already planned for emergency response. Immediately after COVID strike, the country was able to come up with the Kenya Basic Education Emergency Response Plan 2020, which provided interventions for the prevention, control, and the management of COVID-19. In addition, the Ministry of Education developed guidelines on health and safety protocols for the opening of schools. This was in readiness for reopening. The first reopening, which started to take place in October 2020. In addition to that, there was a lot of empowering the institutional managers through training. A training framework was developed, and we also developed 5 modules, different modules, one for education officials, the other one was for teachers and non-teaching staff, the other one was for parents and the entire school community. All these modules were to sensitize, to conduct sensitization programs from the national level to the school level, including the parents. It was based on the understanding that the pandemic was within the communities, hence need also to enhance the capacities of the communities within the school in order for the schools to remain safe, once they reopened. After reopening, a large-scale assessment was done in order to assess where runners are, whether they had lost during the closure, and interventions were made appropriately. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. Really helpful to see how the different levels came to play during the crisis. Thank you. I'm going to now turn over to Lama Al-Natour to give us her experience and perspective from Jordan. So over to you, Lama.
Thank you, Leonora. The first
Apologies, Lama, you're yeah, there you go. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We in Jordan, the Ministry of Education has been facing a lot of influx happening due to the Syrian crisis that predecessored the Iraqi crisis, and then, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. So for 9 years into the Syrian crisis, Jordan hosted above 1.36 million Syrian refugees, which is nearly 15% of the Jordan total population. Not only to meet their humanitarian, but also resilience need, including, of course, the education as a basic service. So in Jordan, there is around 144,000 Syrian school-age children that are hosted in the public schools, which put a lot of stress and pressure on the education system. But nevertheless, Jordan has been handling that very well by establishing a portfolio of crisis management and response. So firstly, the Compact program was designed. The Compact program was designed in Brussels in the conference number 1, which responded to the Syrian crisis, mainly by establishing the Jordan Response Plan, the JRP. Followed by that was the Accelerated Access Initiative, which what we call AI. So the Jordan Response Plan is based on the partnership of 150 hosts, country, local partners and international communities to support the resilience, including also the livelihood and education. So while AAI came thereafter after the JRP, it didn't only provided education services or equitable education, but it broadened the concept of vulnerability. So it focused not only on the Syrian refugees, but also on the vulnerable Jordanians that were affected directly by the Syrian crisis. So the strength of having that and the leadership set up that handled all of that was by mainly establishing the policy dialogue and coordination between the local partners, which are represented by the government and the line ministries, and also the education partners. So the continuous policy dialogue to agree on the vulnerability concept and agenda was mainly guiding the execution of the Jordan Response Plan and the development and the update of the AAI. So Jordan remains steadily committed to support the two plans with a very, very big agenda of a crisis response plans. Next slide, please. Maybe I can share my screen.
If it's okay, Lama, we'll come back to the other points that you wanted to make in the second part of the conversation, if that's okay, because I think that's a very interesting example of kind of the political will that was is very important in Jordan, right? In terms of managing the refugee crisis. So I'm going to turn over now to my colleague, Barbara Tournier, to give us a little bit of background on the role of the middle tier. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Leonora. So as we reflect on how can ministries of education play a leadership role during crisis, I want to highlight the potential of this often neglected layer that is the middle tier. And support structures at that level proved to be key in coping with the COVID-19 crisis. Very briefly, what is the middle tier? Basically, it's that space that you see in green in between the frontline school level and the central level. It's the critical glue that brings the system together and allows for coherence and alignment across the system. Representing those overlapping circle allows to better understand the necessary integration of those groups within education systems to the front line.
Apologies, Barbara, I think you're good to go, sorry.
Okay, can we go back a slide, please? So just representing those overlapping circles allows to better understand the necessary integration of those groups within education systems for the front line to speak to the central level and vice versa, especially in large education systems where the middle tier acts as a critical linchpin between the central and school level. And the middle tier consists of a number of different actors that span across administrative and management functions to position geared towards instructional improvement. You have actors located in offices above the schools, such as district education officers or supervisors, but you've also got school-based actors, such as mentor teachers or head teachers who are brought up to the middle tier to work across schools while keeping their initial role and foot in practice. So in times of crisis, it's critically important that you have a system in place where effective initiatives taken up at the local level can be very quickly shared, scaled up, and communicated on. And for this, you need an effective middle tier. It's equally important to have middle tier actors who can translate central level policy into relevant actions on the ground. And that was very obvious during the COVID lockdowns. Everywhere, staff on the front line were quick to respond and to take initiatives in firefighting mode. And the world over, policymakers were keen to find out about initiatives and strategies being used. Everyone was looking for solutions and wanting to learn what was happening in different settings. So the middle tier can quickly identify effective initiatives and help to shape the central level response. The middle tier, in turn, also plays a key role in translating the central response into actions that make sense in their specific localities. So in research that we conducted with the Education Development Trust, we zoomed in on one category of personnel at the middle tier, instructional leaders, in settings where their roles had been strengthened or given new impetus. And as it happens, we conducted that research at the times of school lockdowns, which enabled us to appreciate their key role during the crisis. And across our case studies, we found that middle tier actors provided socio-emotional support, technological support for shifting lessons online, and also helped to shape the national response. While still facing many challenges through the crisis, so each setting's pre-existing collaborative groups and feedback loops made communication and planning much more efficient in a difficult time. And you can find more information about this in a blog post that I think you will have the link for in the chat. More broadly, in our research on instructional leaders at the middle tier, we identified a number of ways they can act as change agents, and they're up on the screen. I won't go into them for lack of time, but they do sum up in a nutshell our findings on the potential of instructional leaders at the middle tier that will be published shortly. So to sum up, the middle tier plays a critical role, and having those structures in place contributes to effective ministry leadership in times of crisis. And yet, while systems already invest in the middle tier, this level still represents an important source of untapped potential. And we need to harness that potential to better serve the system's needs. And achieving this requires a mindset shift where leadership is distributed across levels and where individuals have agency and are trusted to take initiatives. And that means a shift away from considering middle tier actors as compliance monitors to viewing middle-tier leaders as collaborative problem solvers who coordinate and support agents and who gear education systems towards more collaboration. So of course, there are challenges to making that shift happen, and enabling conditions need to be in place. And I'll be happy to discuss those during the discussion. And I now turn it over to Charlotte Jones from the Education Development Trust to learn more about what happened in terms of leadership at the school level.
Thanks, Leonora, and thanks, Barbara. And hi, everyone. Great to be here today to discuss effective education leadership in crisis. So Education Development Trust's perspective on this topic is both as a practitioner and as a researcher. So as practitioners, we support governments to improve school and teacher effectiveness at scale. And as researchers, well, we've been looking at this question of leadership effectiveness for many years now, researching leadership innovations and changing forms of leadership at all levels of the education system. And you can see some of that research on the slide in front of you. The key perspective I'll focus in on today is head teachers' response to the COVID crisis in Rwanda. And that's based on some research we've undertaken in partnership with the Rwanda Education Board, with the Education Commission and WISE. I would say, though, that although I'll focus on head teachers today, it's important to say that what brings together all of this research and our practice as well is the idea of school leadership, not only as a single position in a school, like a head teacher, but leadership as a practice that involves a matrix, if you like, of many different stakeholders, including those from the middle tier that Barbara talked about, often working beyond the boundaries of one institution. And it's this team vision for effective leadership that was certainly something that was a central feature of the response in Rwanda. If we go on to the next slide. So let me just draw your attention to a couple of features of the Rwandan education, the Rwandan school leadership landscape pre-COVID that I think helped to support head teachers' initiative during the crisis. So firstly, there was a network of about 500 system leaders in place, so leaders of learning. And these are very high-performing head teachers nationally, and they have like a formal outreach role to support the CPD of their peer head teachers. So they're a kind of new middle-tier role in the way that Barbara was just talking about. Secondly, one of the things that these leaders of learning do is they run a network nationally of professional learning communities, PLCs, and these are monthly meetings of a cluster of head teachers to discuss school improvement in their local area. And before COVID, about 90% of heads in Rwanda regularly attended those PLCs. So it was a very well-established, quite a mature network, and you can see one of those in the photo on the slide. In terms of the crisis context in Rwanda, schools were shut for the best part of a year in 2020, and then there was a very energetic back-to-school campaign led by REB, which really focused on equity. And from early on in the crisis, head teachers were very much empowered by REB to be active in leading the crisis response in their locality and to continue with these PLCs to coordinate this. And they were all given smartphones and training on virtual facilitation so that they could shift the PLCs online. So for this research, it looks at the role of head teachers in this crisis response. And if you want to hear more, I invite you to listen to there's a podcast on our website with my colleagues and from Amy Bellinger at the Education Commission. And I think the link is in the chat as well.
Great. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for those introductory remarks that really whet our appetite for some more. So let's delve into the panel discussion. Part one of this discussion will focus on concrete examples of how the ministry at the central, middle tier, and school levels demonstrated leadership in a crisis, and also in the hopes to kind of distill some of those capacities at the institutional, organizational, or individual levels that enabled this leadership. So to jump right in, I'm going to first turn to our colleague Anne Gachoya from Kenya. So over to you, Anne. I think you're on mute, Anne. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. We find that there were individual capacities as well as the institutional capacity that enabled the Ministry of Education to manage the COVID-19 crisis. One of the requirements was the capacity to set and achieve the goals. We find that with the COVID-19, it required readers who can take fast and decisive actions. For example, when we come to closure of schools, when we come to curfews, when we come to restrictions, especially on road transport, over 70% of learners in Kenya use public transport. So congestion in transport vehicles was key, and this required leadership skills in order to make decisive action. There was also the capacity on guiding and influencing the behavior of others. This is in relation to making people also understand and even know the problem that the COVID-19 virus was to bring to them. And through the leadership skills that our leaders had, including the head of state, he took it to himself, and he is the one who was also announcing. And when it was coming from the head of state, announcing about prevention management, everybody took it very seriously and followed the instructions and followed the behavior that was expected to be maintained. More so on congestion. We can move to the next slide for the 1 minute. Okay, we find that the Kenya had pre-existing culture of risk reduction. This is because previously there has been drought, floods, and all those kind of things. Hence, a crisis was not very new to Kenya, and hence able to deal with COVID-19. We also find there were ministries, foundations, development partners, civil society organizations. They all came together, and there was effective cross-sectoral cooperation between everyone. I've said there was very critical political goodwill and the leadership support that was evidenced from even the cabinet secretary, all levels, when it was time for assessing a preparedness for schools in readiness for reopening. It was done by the cabinet secretaries themselves, and even the head of state visited some schools. So that kind of leadership was very critical because they could show people the way. There was also the designing of policies, procedures, and the plans. In Kenya, we had several policies, procedures, plans, and all that, which gave a basis within which we could come up with the plan to deal with COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Anne. That's a really salient example of the different capacities that existed within the Ministry of Education and helped the leadership there effectively manage the COVID crisis. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to turn now to Lama to hear your example of how, some of the capacities that have helped the Ministry of Education to manage the Syrian refugee crisis. So over to you, Lama.
Thank you. Well, here in Jordan, as I mentioned,
Apologies, Lama, you're on mute. I'm trying to unmute you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Keep going to unmute. I don't know why.
Apologies.
Okay, no problem. So for the Jordan response system, it really is based on establishing a big portfolio of crisis management and response. The idea about establishing the big portfolio is to ally all supporters under one joint trust funds to allow easier tracking, avoid duplication, demand-driven support, relevance, effectiveness, and compliance, and establish a very, very continuous and fruitful series of policy coordination and alliance. So the other thing that helped us a lot is to address the big portfolio of vulnerability and concept. So it's not only based, as I mentioned, on influx and the refugees concept only, but it is based on the vulnerability in its broader concept of addressing the students' vulnerability regardless of nationality to ensure equitable education, and most importantly, the coexistence and integration to gain acceptance and buy-in and ownership of all, of the whole community and of all partners. Furthermore, Jordan has developed, most importantly, a very, very robust education during emergency plan. It was called IIEP. And this emergency plan helped to respond rapidly to the crisis. So it is constituted of 3 phases: response, remedial and recovery, and sustainability. So it will base the sustainability on the response and the remedial lessons learned to establish a more integrative education during emergency system that blends the different modalities of education and also blends the different initiatives outcomes. So it is a continuous learning journey and plan. And also Jordan established education during emergency team that is 24 hours team. And it is not only based on the center, but also based on the field, including directorates and school. So all of this provided a roadmap to ensure sustainability of equitable and responsive education and also health precautions. Jordan also made sure to update the data management system of it. So it built the capacity of its center and field staff and continue to update the system to respond to the different demands of education as we learn, of course, from the field. So it is down, up, demand updates. Jordan also is in the process of developing a blended learning strategy and continue to build the capacity of the center and field and reinforce decentralization to respond to the education different modalities, which is actually basing not only the education as a system, but also the attendance of students. You know, Jordan has very overcrowded schools and has to live with the continuous influx also, not only from the refugees, but also from the private sector. So the crowdness is an issue. We established a lot of modalities to overcome crowdness, like the PPP, public-private partnership, that we are in the process of functionalizing. And we, as I mentioned, we established the concept of the blended learning strategy that is currently under development. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sama. That's really a good example as well. I'm going to turn to Barbara. And Barbara, I'd like to hear from you about some of those enabling factors at the middle tier. Lama mentioned the importance of the decentralization reform in Jordan. So let's hear a little bit from you about the middle tier and those enabling factors. Oops, you're on mute. Are you able to? There you go.
Sorry.
No worries. Bye-bye.
So I'd like to speak to 3 enabling conditions to have effective leadership at the middle tier. The first condition really is about having a vision coming from the central level that the middle tier workforce is really recognized as a vital asset that is key for policy implementation and change. And awareness of this dependency on that level in our case studies led to a recognition that there was a need to strengthen and professionalize middle tier actors. But unfortunately, as I said earlier, that the middle tier is often neglected and they're in other settings. And there's really a need to focus on the architecture of education systems and the capacity at various levels. That's the delivery structures, the key workforce roles and the leaders. But in recent decades, there's been a lot of emphasis on the school level and a tendency to admit that you need a continuum of professionalization across the delivery chain from the school to the central level. And the second condition is really making sure that you have the right people in place. And that brings up the question of the legitimacy of leaders at the middle tier, which is really key. So in our case studies, policymakers paid a lot of attention to making sure that they were recruiting the right people for the post. And they typically recruited middle tier instructional leaders from expert practitioners because they were well-respected professionals who could garner an immediate measure of respect from their peers. And in many contexts, that context where IIEP works, we'll still find that there's a problem related to the profile of management personnel and the lack of recruitment criteria and procedures. We see instances of nominations to leadership positions being made based on years of service or political connections without criteria in place for those nominations. And we also see instances where staff at the district level is appointed without formal recruitment processes, but based on health or personal reasons. And this is not the way forward. Policymakers need to invest in strengthening and professionalizing the middle tier through stronger recruitment policies and hence professional status and high quality professional development. And the third condition relates to what we've referred to as an empowering culture based on trust and autonomy. And this was really identified as a critical success factor, whereby an empowering culture exists that grants autonomy to professionals and seeks to strengthen their mastery. So middle tier actors in our case studies were permitted to use their professional judgment to support teaching and learning. And policymakers trusted these local system leaders to interpret and adapt broad policy directions and make them relevant to the context. And this is related to the question of agency and distributed leadership. You need leadership at all levels, from the school up to the ministry. And this requires a mindset shift. And it's about breaking the top-down direction of ministries of education and the bureaucratic culture that hinders leadership at lower levels. And in fact, that bureaucratic culture fosters a culture which promotes strict adherence to rules and procedures, often at the cost of local needs and priorities. So in that sense, building a sense of collective agency and responsibility is really a key feature of the middle tier's work. And leaders need to be seen as solution builders rather than commanding and controlling.
Great, thank you. And I think that segues very well into Charlotte's question, which is at the school level, what capacities enable and facilitate leadership in crisis settings? Over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Leonora. Yeah, so let me talk about two key relationships that were key for head teachers that really came out of the research in Rwanda, and the networking capacities and skills that supported those. So firstly, we saw that an enhanced relationship with parents and the community was a key feature of school leadership during the pandemic in Rwanda. So for example, 97% of teachers that we surveyed said that they worked with community leaders beyond the school to make sure that vulnerable children got back to school. And we know as well that head teachers work with the parental board to support home learning. And 50% of them, interestingly, said that they supported parents with things like well-being and emotional support during the crisis as well. Secondly, in terms of relationships, peer relationships between head teachers were important. So they really saw each other as a resource and as capacity. So the school leadership networks that I mentioned, the PLCs, they were a key success factor in helping head teachers have a sense of agency and to organise their response. So they were using the PLCs to strategize on, how can we support home learning, even things like how can we support teachers to make sure they're continuing with their CPD all throughout the school closures. So whatever topic was relevant, as things shifted and new priorities emerged, the PLCs acted as a kind of platform for the head teachers to get organised. So, for example, they had the special needs education coordinators come in and present at PLCs to support head teachers to think about what are the risks that children with disabilities might face in returning to school. So I think in summary, this ability to build lateral relationships was really key to resilience. And we've seen this at EDT across our research, actually in the UK, in other countries, in Kenya as well, where head teachers are understanding that the resources, the motivations, and all the skills that they need to respond to crisis are distributed beyond the boundary of the school. And I think just one last observation. We've also seen some quite surprising things here about what the skills are that are needed to make a success of that more kind of distributed way of working. I think we often think about resilience as been about, the hard stuff, grit, determination. But we saw that a key success factor was actually school leaders' ability to be vulnerable, to be honest about both successes and failures. So it's this kind of self-awareness, vulnerability, humility, that was as important as the more obvious kind of, be strong mentality that we might immediately think about when we think about crisis management. And of course, you can't do that. You can't be vulnerable in that way without trust in the relationships. So the healthier those relationships are ahead of crisis, the better position you'll be in, the better readiness you will have when crisis does arrive.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting to hear about the individual capacities that are needed, and particularly functioning around trust and trusting relationships, and the essential nature of having those relationships. Thanks a lot. We're going to move to part 2. After having heard of successes, we're going to delve into some of the challenges for leadership at the different levels. And we're going to think a little bit too about, and this has come up in many of your examples, about how the different levels can more effectively work together through feedback loops and effective communication. So for the first question, I'm going to turn quickly to Charlotte, actually. I'm going to go right back to you. So we'll go bottom up this time.
Right, on topic. So, I think you need both bottom up and top down, and maybe a bit of sideways as well. So the PLCs in Rwanda, they're not completely bottom up. There's an important catalyst role that I described earlier, the middle tier role of those system leaders that I talked about. They help to facilitate the PLC meeting. So you do need that kind of coordination from the middle tier to support the network to work. I think it's important to say that the ministry's top-down action was a really important part of the story here as well, around supporting school leaders' response. So REB, for example, were very clear in their back-to-school campaign. This was going to be about equity, getting vulnerable children, identifying them, supporting them to catch up. And then they delegated the how and the strategizing to the head teachers. So they had that really clear directive flowing down, and the head teachers are given the autonomy to build solutions. I really like how you put that, Barbara, and use the PLCs as a structure to do that. And they got on with it, and they oversaw data collection of vulnerable children in each school locality. And they started having these data-rich conversations in their PLCs about hard cases and how they were going to take action to get them back to school. So there's a kind of top-down bit there. But interestingly, there was a strong feedback loop upwards as well. So that data on the vulnerable kids, it was aggregated and it was sent to the local inspectors. So again, middle tier role, who then sent that information onto the ministry to inform, what might the future interventions need to be. So I think what we saw happening was different levels all working together in, I would say, quite an adaptive system in many ways, with some really strong feedback loops helping to get the right information and support to the right people at the right time. And as a result, I think I saw the data over the last couple of weeks, 96% of students have returned to school in Rwanda, and all schools, 100% of schools that we surveyed, report having assessed learners to ascertain learning levels on their return to school.
Great. And Barbara, from your side, from your perspective and the research that you've done on the middle tier, what are some of the challenges with regards to leadership?
So in our research, we identified a couple of challenges for effective leadership at the middle tier. And the first one is the limited capacity to act. The middle tier has a lack of visibility, which may derive from its limited capacity to act in terms of its resources, authority, and autonomy. And that traditionally may be the result of decentralization, where the transfer of responsibilities through the decentralization process has not always been accompanied by an increase in its capacity. A second challenge is really to bear in mind that that shift in mindset that I was talking about requires building buy-in. You need to allow time for the trust to be established between teachers and leaders who are just taking on new roles, and to be aware that a new post description is really not sufficient to change the culture of a service, and that will take time. And lastly, to be cognizant that building complex networks of support and collaboration for teachers, again, takes time and consolidation. And the first hurdle is really getting people on board and allowing for buying into the program, and also allowing time for the reforms to generate results. And although policymakers or legislators often want to have immediate results, it's just going to, having those types of structural and systemic change will take time. And to make sure that you build that buy-in, it's really critical that information is disseminated to the public. And across our case studies, policymakers face challenges in disseminating knowledge and learning more widely.
Great, thank you, Barbara. I think that's an interesting point about communicating down some of the policy decisions. And I'd like to hear and turn to Lama now to hear a little bit more about that. Some of the challenges related to multi-directional information sharing and decision-making in Jordan.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in Jordan, we have struggled, to be honest, with capacity building because the crisis, especially the COVID-19, came sudden. And also the Syrian crisis also came in a very, very critical timing where Jordan was struggling with its economy. So the capacity building that we have done so far is not adequate, to be honest, especially to leaders. We still need more capacity building to address the data utilization competencies, to be able to utilize data for decision making and making the action of down, up. It's not only up, down. So we need, in another meaning, as a center to step aside and act as facilitators and empower the field to act and to practice the decentralization in its efficient manner and system. So we need to build our capacities more. We need to outline the roles and responsibilities, the right distribution and segregation of duties between the field and the center correctly and clearly. So far, we have a program called School Directorates Development Program. This program is under revision to make sure that we update the channels of communication, the monitoring and evaluation, the governance and accountability between the center and the field, and empower the field more to act on a decentralized level. The other thing that we need maybe, or we have learned and we need to address more, is the self-efficacy and well-being, not only of students, but also of our staff. We have a demotivated staff. We need to build their confidence. So in order for the teacher to convince the student not to drop out, we need to build their confidence, to build their motivation, to build their well-being as well, to ensure resilience and retention. So we need to work on this more. The education during emergency came in a right timing and helped us a lot to establish several layers of committees and let's say a diverse team that works together to respond to the emergencies, but yet decentralization needs to be empowered more. And we need also to demonstrate the right distribution of roles and responsibilities. And most importantly, we need to give more resources to our staff and teachers, especially the mid-tier staff and leaders. We need to empower them with more resources to be able to monitor, evaluate, and report. So the resources is not only technological, but also it's learning resources, technical resources, more communication and exchange of information, peer-to-peer. So we need to work on this more to be able to equip our teachers, to equip our leaders with more confidence, power to act and to respond to crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm going to turn to Anne. Thank you very much, Lama, for that example, and emphasizing again the importance of communication for the agency of actors at all levels. Really, thanks for that. I'm going to turn to Anne now for an example of some of the challenges as well for multi-directional information making, information sharing, and decision making. So over to you, Anne. I believe you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. In Kenya, while quick decisions were required at critical moments, there is some bureaucracy which could delay actions to be taken at a certain point. In my view, at the institutional level and even at the organization level, there could be need for autonomy to enhance the autonomy, especially at the school level, so that the head teachers could make fast and quick decisions for action. The other point is on consultations. There were quite lengthy consultations because of involvement of line ministries, various consultations at all levels. This also sometimes could delay the action which could have been taken. The same as the cross-sectoral collaboration and all that. Basically, you could not just make a decision or even do something. Hence, this collaboration also sometimes could also pose a challenge. We have like the national government, we have the county government, we have so many line ministries, civil society organizations, foundations. We have quite a number, and all those were supposed to be brought together. So that now brought in the issue of coordination, coordinating now all these agencies, which were also preventing, managing, and controlling COVID-19 pandemic. So the issue of coordination was critical, how to coordinate all these agencies that were actually also doing the same interventions. The communication also indeed is very critical. At this point, it was very critical and it was very key in order to ensure that the sharing of information, decision making regarding COVID-19 were done in good time. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot for that example. And I think it's really interesting how many times we've said the words communication and coordination throughout the first hour of this webinar. Key words for today. We are going to move on to the third and final part of this plenary session, and then we'll move into group work. We are a little bit over time, so I will ask our panelists to kindly speak very quickly to your final thoughts and let us know in your opinion, what are those most important next steps for central, middle tier, and school levels to work effectively together. And I'm going to start. We'll go bottom up this time again. I'll start with Charlotte. Over to you.
Thanks. So three things quickly. So I think formalizing some of the collaborative aspects of the head teacher role that we know are critical for effective crisis response. So, for example, REB is committed in Rwanda to include parental collaboration in the new leadership standards and to clarify school leaders' responsibilities in relation to learner well-being. Secondly, a key next step, I think one of the best investments policymakers can make for resilience is investing in collaborative.
We seem to have lost you, but I dare to guess that you were saying to invest in collaboration and coordination, with those being the key words for today. So Charlotte, I'm going to move ahead with Barbara. And Charlotte, you can jump in perhaps at the end because the connection seems to have been lost now. So over to you, Barbara, with your final thoughts.
Thanks, Leonora. So I briefly, because I know we're over time, want to make a strong plea for further investment in the middle tier, because it allows to offset the tendency of education systems to overly focus on accountability and compliance monitoring, which is not what is called for in times of crisis. On the other hand, in a supportive environment, teachers may be more apt to embrace reforms or motivated to make the additional efforts that will be required from them in times of hardship, and they'll be more comfortable to try new strategies or teaching methods and adapt to the situation. And the major argument for doing that is that governments are already investing in the middle tier, so it doesn't require considerable system change, and governments should consider it as an easily actionable reform. And the final point is that there are a number of roles that call for further research if we are really to strengthen if you really want to strengthen the middle tier. So we looked at instructional leaders, but you've got other actors in administration and management who also play a critical role in ensuring quality of education and making sure that frontline actors can deliver in the best conditions possible. So further investigating the roles and structures and resources used to coordinate and improve teaching. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Barbara. And I'm going to turn to Anne, actually, for the very same question. The most important next steps, I know you have a list there, but if you were to choose 2 or 3, what are the most important next steps for these levels to work together? Anne, over to you. Unfortunately, you're on mute. There you go.
Okay. There's a problem there. Okay. Enhancing the capacity at all levels, I would put that top in the priority. I would also put including crisis management and the response in the government plan, including the sector education plan for the ministry. I would also put the issue of coordinating various teams and equipping education managers at institutional level with the leadership skills. The other thing which I would do is to document all the best practices from other countries and use that for future crisis response mechanism. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I agree that documenting and learning from history is extremely important in moving forward. And I'm going to turn to Lama for your final thoughts as well.
Thank you, Leonora. I think without visionary, aligned, and well-planned strategic plans and frameworks, any crisis will certainly widen gaps between center and field and high and mid-tier leadership. So we need to make sure that we all work under one framework where all roles and responsibilities, reporting systems, down up and up down, are clear and oriented. The decentralization of authorities and actions should be well introduced and well trained on in order for the field to act upon. Also, the leaders at the different layers should be provided and supported with enough capacity building and also adequate resources and tools to close any digital and data divides to be able to monitor and report. So we need to work on M&E, governance, accountability, and information systems and documentation, as mentioned. The last thing is we need to try to move to technology more. We need to think about e-government that we're actually currently working on. E-government, if it was introduced in the right format after re-engineering of processes are conducted, will establish more resilient systems at the time of management and enable any system to manage crises efficiently. But as I mentioned, it has to be introduced like scientifically and based on re-engineering. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much to Lama, to Anne, to Barbara, and to Charlotte for such a rich conversation looking at the system's capacities. We're going to now take leave. For those of you who have signed up and have demonstrated interest to join us in the group work, please stay online. you will be automatically pulled into one of the groups that will be facilitated by IIEP colleagues. And for those that understandably are not able to join us, please note that this webinar has been recorded, and we'll be putting forward some of the key takeaways in the coming weeks. So we thank you all for your attention and for your participation on the Padlet. I've seen there's been quite some activity there. We'll take a quick break of approximately 3 minutes, let's say, as the groups are being made and as you're being pulled in. And we look forward to another rich discussion in smaller groups before we come back to plenary for some key takeaway points from our panelists. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you in the small groups. So greetings, colleagues, and apologies for those of you who may have been mid-sentence as we were all pulled back virtually into this room. We are 91 people right now. I think that the breakout rooms, everyone has come back. I hope you've traveled safely from the breakout room. We're going to quickly hear from each of the groups some of the key takeaways. And I would like to turn to Anne, if that's possible, Anne Gachoya, to hear about, from you how the discussion went and what were some of the key takeaways in your group. Can you unmute yourself, please? There you go.
Yes, thank you. Our group had 21 participants, and some of the takeaways include the following. One is that the participants have noted that strengthening capacities at the 3 levels is crucial in order to respond appropriately to such crises. The other is effective communication and the coordination has come out very boldly that there is need to enhance communication and the coordination with all the stakeholders in information sharing between different levels is as well very critical. The other takeaway is the top-bottom bureaucracy structures that exist in some countries, while this also limits autonomy, more so at the institutional levels. And what we have taken away is that we also need leadership, innovation, creativity at all levels. A lot of it, creativity and innovativeness to come up. Then the focus also on the 3 levels has also proved very fundamental as far as addressing a crisis response is concerned. So those are the major takeaways from Team 5.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. It sounds like a really rich conversation. Let's go to group number 1. Could I turn to you, Lama, for some feedback from your group?
Sure, thank you, Leonora. We had 19 participants, and actually the discussion was very interesting and very fruitful. The takeaways is that effective leadership to crisis management cannot be achieved without adequate coordination, communication, data sharing between the different levels of leadership. And most importantly, which was focused by the participants, is the political will to make the change, like assign enough budget, respond to emergency with efficient leadership, and empowerment of decentralization, establish preparedness and sustainability of response, and finally, develop the learning experiences from the crisis and bring in innovation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the importance of political will and kind of learning across the different levels. Let's turn to the group that Barbara was in. Over to you, Barbara.
Hi again. So it was 18 of us, and we had an interesting discussion. A couple of points came up. The first one was really about coordination and collaboration across tiers and the challenges with that collaboration. And how do you make it happen, really, and challenges around that as, people that are really busy. So you've got to create the space for that collaboration to happen. And also, how do you keep people motivated or incentivized to go the extra length? And then we also discussed about professional development, and that doesn't always respond to teachers' needs, and how the linkages between the different levels and where professional development best fits. Whether it should be provided, well, we didn't go that far, but by teacher training institutions or by different levels of the system. And also we had quite a bit of a discussion about the capacity and making sure that the capacity exists at lower levels, especially in the context of decentralization, when we need to increase the capacity of local actors and provide them with training on disaster risk reduction. And then finally, there was a question about digital learning devices, and that was quite specific on what best devices exist for remote learning.
Great, thanks a lot. I think that's interesting that in your group, Barbara, the issue of motivation came up, and perhaps that's a future research area to explore motivation as it affects leaders, particularly in crisis settings, right? Since you've done quite a lot of work on motivation already. So
I have,
perhaps that could be another angle of analysis, food for thought. I'm going to turn to the group that Charlotte was in. Charlotte, would you like to give us some of the key takeaways that came out of your group?
Sure, thanks, Leonora, and thanks to all the group for your contributions. So key takeaways, I think in general, there was a feeling that people really appreciated the 3 levels. That was quite helpful as a framing device. And people found the discussion on the middle tier kind of really resonated. And a bit like Barbara's group, discussions and questions about, well, how can we use the capacities at the school level in the middle tier better and empower those actors, not just work at ministry level. And we talked quite a lot about communication as well between the 3 levels, picking up on the discussions in the presentations. And then in terms of next steps, there was a very lively discussion, but I'm going to pick out one thing, and that's around data. So we had quite a big discussion about data and what better data systems and data flows up and down the system might look like, and an observation that quite often in humanitarian context, we can sometimes set up parallel systems just because of the need to work quickly and work directly with the ministry, and that can sometimes actually erode capacity at other levels and bypass other levels. So what might it look like if we had better protocols for data sharing and data collection that aren't a duplication of efforts? There's something to think about.
Sorry, that sounds like a really rich conversation as well. And I think I'm also tasked with trying to sum up from my group. So I'll apologize to my group if I don't do it justice, but I think some of the things that were already said by the other groups did indeed come up. The importance of building capacities of the different authorities to manage and respond to crises across the different levels. We had a really interesting example of managing learning loss and planning for, recovery of learning loss through the different levels working together. And I thought that was really a salient example of how some networks across those levels have been institutionalized in order, to maintain that communication on a regular basis. And I think also one of the other, another key point that was made in our group as well was around the importance of information sharing through those feedback loops that, are ideally institutionalized and that include looking at the data at the different levels. And the point, that Charlotte, your group seemed to make around data and making sure that they're harmonized data sets was complemented in a way by the discussion in our group about what kind of data and for what purpose, right? It's great to have lots of information, but having it, specifically for a specific purpose and being clear on that is important. So with that, I think I would just like to kind of end by really thanking colleagues and participants, panelists. We've had really rich conversations these past 2 hours. So I just wanted to thank you all for all of your insights and for sharing your experiences. The Padlet reflections will be shared with you subsequently. And for more information, you can check out our website and our Education for Resilience website as well. And then, of course, and this is where I think it will be interesting, building on kind of today's conversation where we heard quite often the importance of communication and information sharing. Please join us on Wednesday for the webinar that's taking place at the same time, same place, maybe a different link, but on strengthening systems learning for Ministry of Education Leadership in Crisis Settings. So we've got another great lineup there. And we really look forward to hearing from you and to having you with us on Wednesday. And I think that was it from my side. Just one final word is a post-webinar survey will come up as you sign off. So we would really appreciate your feedback. Speaking of feedback loops, that will help us improve our offer and our facilitation and organization of these kinds of events. So please, if you have the time, please fill out the post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you again with us on Wednesday. Thanks a lot, everyone.